Yeah, so I'm going to talk about some work that I've been doing to introduce methods to account for uncertainty in the land surface model within your NWP ensembles. And this work is really motivated by the future development of a coupled land atmosphere data assimilation system for NCEP's operational NWP system, which is called the GFS. So the background for this is that NWP ensembles currently underestimate the forecast uncertainty at and near the land surface. And this is really not a surprise given that the ensemble methods that we have at the moment don't explicitly account for any uncertainty in the land surface model. And so I've just showed an example here. On the right, I've got 4 plots of forecast uncertainty, which I'm just defining as the forecast error standard deviation. For the top, it's soil moisture in the surface layer. For the bottom, it's the 2-meter temperature. These plots on the right are the ensemble standard deviation estimates from NCEP's operational ensemble, and the plots on the left are independent estimates of the forecast uncertainty that I've calculated by comparing forecasts to independent observations. So this is sort of my best guess of what the ensemble standard deviation should look like. And you can see quite obviously that we're under-dispersed. And so, yeah, the objective of this work is then to better represent that forecast uncertainty at and near the land surface as a sort of first step to implementing, as I said before, a coupled land atmosphere data assimilation. I can't move to my next slide. What's going on? Okay, so before going on to that, I just want to take a minute to talk about some of the differences between land models and atmospheric models, because they're quite fundamentally different and in ways that affect the error propagation in each system. And so we need to design our ensemble systems in ways that are aware of that. So the most important issue here is that the land is strongly forced or dissipative, which means that basically if you run a forecast for long enough, it will converge to a state determined entirely by its forcing, regardless of what the initial conditions were. So this is very different from an atmospheric system where you've got sensitive dependence on initial conditions and chaotic error growth. And so in an atmospheric system, you can actually learn a lot about the error structure in your forecast by initializing from different initial conditions. By contrast, in a land model, all that's going to show, if you initialize from slightly different initial conditions, all it's going to show you in the forecast is basically the difference that you initialized it with, which will have dissipated slightly. The other issue is that land surface models don't, at least as used in NWP, don't simulate horizontal flow between grid cells. Each grid cell is just modeled independently. So there's also no horizontal flow of any error information. Okay, so given the importance of the atmospheric forcing to our land model, I thought the best place to start is by looking at the spread in the fields from the atmospheric model that force the land surface. So what I've plotted here, well, first of all, I'm going to attempt to do a sort of rough evaluation of the ensemble spread in NCEP's operational GFS by comparing it to the typical spread that's used in an offline land data assimilation system. And in those offline land data assimilation systems that are ensemble-based, they were typically developed before atmospheric ensembles were widespread. And so most are designed to take a single realization of the atmosphere and then create an ensemble of forcing fields by adding random perturbations to the important forcing fields, with those perturbations sort of drawn from our best estimate of what we think the uncertainty in that field is. And so I've compared here on the right is the ensemble spread from the GFS, and then on the left is the typical ensemble spread that might be used in an offline system. Precipitation on the top, downwelling long wave in the middle, downwelling short wave in the bottom. For precipitation and short wave, given that they're both frequently zero, when we apply the perturbations in the offline system, we do it multiplicatively. For long wave, it's done additively, hence you see that uniform distribution across the globe. Looking at these, sort of two things stand out. The first is that the spatial patterns for the GFS appear to be more realistic or more sensible. For precipitation, you've got a much larger area of non-negligible spread, and that's because this is an ensemble calculated from different atmospheric realizations, so it's able to account for uncertainty in the location of precipitation, which can't be done in that offline system where you're just sort of randomly perturbing a single realization. Likewise, for long wave, obviously that's potentially a more realistic than having just uniform uncertainty everywhere. For short wave as well, this is in the offline system, it's done multiplicatively, which means that you're going to have the greatest uncertainty where you've got the greatest short wave under clear sky conditions. And yet under clear sky conditions, we are actually relatively confident of the forecast. Whereas, and then if you compare that to the image from the GFS, you've got the greatest spread there where there's some uncertainty in the location of clouds. So that's the first thing is that if we use the actual atmospheric ensemble, a predictable result, it appears to look more realistic. The other thing is if you look at the magnitudes, it looks like we've underestimated the spread in the radiation, in both of the radiation terms. However, if you look at the experience from offline ensemble DA, you can't get enough spread in your land states just by perturbing your forcing fields. You also need to perturb your states in some way. So even if we were to fix to enhance the spread in our radiation, I don't think that would quite be enough. So we need to also add a method for accounting for land model uncertainty. And so what I've done here is I've basically looked at the methods that are applied in the atmosphere and in the land communities, and then sort of tested various ones that are sort of I regarded as appropriate. So I've tested 3 main methods. The first I've called state pert. This consists of stochastically perturbing the soil moisture and soil temperature at every time step. Recall I said before, we don't get a lot from perturbing the initial conditions, so we need to keep hitting those states with perturbations as we go through the forecast. This is a very standard approach that's used in offline land data assimilation systems. One of the issues with this is that you need to make an assumption about the correlations or lack of correlations between the errors that you apply to the soil moisture and the soil temperature. And those errors can actually change signs depending on what the local conditions are. So in the next experiment, I used SPPT. And so this is basically the idea behind SPPT, or stochastically perturbed physics tendencies, is that you basically store the change in those states over the time step and then hit that change with a perturbation. And the advantage of this is I can now use the model to give me the perturbations that I apply, the relationship between the perturbations to soil moisture and soil temperature. And then sort of extending on that idea even further, in the third experiment, I've called param-pert. In this one, I stochastically perturb key parameters that control the land atmosphere fluxes. So it's the same idea here, is by perturbing the flux, I can then use the model physics itself to give me consistent perturbations between the different variables. In particular, in this case, I now get consistent perturbations between the land and the atmosphere. So I've tested each of these in a suite of experiments, which basically just use our operational system as it existed in 2019, and I've just simplified it a lot. And I'm running each experiment out for 30 days, then comparing the results. In all of these experiments, I'm assimilating the standard atmospheric observations and using the standard atmospheric stochastic physics schemes. Okay, to look at the results, I'm going to present quite a few images that look like this one. So I'm just going to go through this one in detail first. So what I've done, I ran each experiment for 30 days and then sort of produced maps like I showed you on the first slide. And then to condense the information in those maps, what I've done is I've binned the results by SWE. SWE is just soil wetness index. So it's soil moisture scale between 0 and 1. So this is the forecast uncertainty or ensemble spread for the ensemble experiments from each of my estimates binned by SWE. There's nothing special about using soil moisture here. I also compared this, I created similar plots against various temperature metrics and vegetation, and they all look the same. So the way I'm not sort of implying there's something special about the role of soil moisture here. It's a convenient way to represent the data. So I want you to interpret this as the variability when you go from dry, warm locations to wetter, cooler locations. So yeah, I've got each of my ensemble experiments. There's also a control run, which is just the, without any of my specific land perturbation experiments. And then I've also added in the target. So this is my estimate of what I think the ensemble spread should look like based on comparison to observations. So if we look at the results here, if we start with the state PERT experiment, this is this turquoisey one up here. You can see that it's created far too much spread in dry conditions. I should point out that I haven't tuned these experiments to give the magnitude I expect. I'm more just interested in seeing how they behave. So the thing that concerns me here is that we've got, we've lost this sort of symmetric-ish distribution that we had in the target obs. And instead, we're now getting a lot more spread in dry conditions. The reason this is happening is because soil moisture has a longer memory in dry conditions. And so when we're adding those perturbations, they're basically just accumulating faster under dry conditions. So straight away, this is sort of not looking like a great solution. Next up, looking at SPPT, which is this green one, you can see it hasn't added a huge amount of spread. I did comment before that I didn't tune these experiments to add the magnitude I was expecting. However, this was actually the most I could get out of SPPT. And what's going on here is that you have to hit for soil moisture, you have to hit the tendency with a positive perturbation, or you create model instabilities, which winds up limiting the size of the perturbations you can add. And then also, if you look at the change in soil moisture in an individual time step, it tends to be very small anyway. So you're basically taking a very small change and then hitting it with a limited perturbation. And this turns out to be the most that you can the most spread that you can induce. So straight away, I've kind of disregarded SPPT as a solution for that reason. Looking at the next one, param-pert. So in this case, I perturbed the vegetation fraction. It has also not created a huge amount of spread, but I don't think there's anything sort of intrinsic in this method that limits the amount of spread that it can create. The other thing is it's also retained this sort of symmetric-ish distribution that we see from the target and also in the control. Okay, so moving on to look at the same plots for 2-meter temperature and specific humidity. So 2-meter temperature on the left, specific humidity on the right. I've plotted these because there's a big diurnal cycle in these variables. I've separated out as to nighttime and daytime on the bottom. Again, I've got my target. You can see the target is much higher than all of my experiments. I'm a little disappointed. I was expecting to see a little bit more spread induced, but it's possible it's just, I'm a land person, so maybe I think the land is sort of more important than it really is. But, obviously not all of the model uncertainty, not all the forecast uncertainty in your 2-meter variables is going to be due to the land. Still, I would have liked to have seen a bit more here. A few other things stand out. First of all, we're getting a really large amount of spread from the state PERT and SPPT experiments in the 2-meter temperature at nighttime. That's associated with the fact that both of those experiments actually induced a huge amount of spread in the soil temperature, which I haven't shown you. The other thing that's just sort of interesting is that the parameter perturbation experiment has actually reduced the spread in the daytime specific humidity and to a lesser extent in the 2-meter temperature. And what's going on here is that in all of my other experiments and also in the operational system, there are certain locations over the tropics where the ensemble sort of bifurcates, where you've got a really large difference between the ensemble members that have rain locally and those that don't. And my vegetation, when I perturbed the vegetation fraction, this actually had the result of slightly warming the ensemble, warming the mean, and this reduced the difference between the precipitating and non-precipitating members. So I think here, this is really just a curiosity, but there's a warning here for us that, when we add these land perturbation schemes, it can change the mean behavior of the ensemble, which can then have these follow-on effects. One thing in this study, I've only looked at the impact on the error covariances from the ensemble. I haven't actually looked at the impact on the skill, but there are quite a few examples in the literature of people showing improvements in skill by introducing land perturbation schemes like this. And I do have some colleagues at EMC who are looking into this at the moment. Okay, moving on to look at the ensemble correlations. This is where things get interesting, I think. So what I've got here is the correlations between the soil moisture and 2-meter temperature on the left, and then specific humidity on the right. Again, nighttime on the top, daytime on the bottom. We see a few interesting things here. First of all, for the state first of all, if we look at this top left plot, the correlations are positive between soil moisture and 2-meter temperature during the night in dry conditions. This is actually incorrect. If you look at and this is an issue in the model. It's not related to my particular perturbation approaches. But stepping aside from that, if we look at the state perturbation experiment, you can see that during dry conditions, it has generally increased the pre-existing correlations. And this makes sense because in dry conditions, typically the soil moisture controls the partition of incoming radiation into latent and sensible heat fluxes. And so in these conditions, basically the soil moisture is driving the land atmosphere coupling. And so if I add perturbations directly to the soil moisture, I'm just going to enhance this relationship. On the other hand, the parameter perturbation experiment seems to have just reinforced, strengthened the correlations sort of in each location in general. And again, this makes sense. The land atmosphere coupling is caused by the fluxes of moisture and energy between the land and the atmosphere, and the parameter perturbation, by perturbing the vegetation fraction, I'm effectively perturbing those fluxes and just enhancing that pre-existing relationship. And then moving on to my final slide of results. This is the same as in the previous slide, but now I'm showing soil temperature instead of soil moisture. And we see sort of the flip side of what we saw on the previous slide. If we look at the state PERT experiments, it's now reduced many of the correlations compared to the control experiment. And this also makes sense if we think about the model physics. So if we think about this one down here, so this is the daytime correlation between soil temperature and 2-meter temperature. In this case, the land atmosphere coupling is largely driven from the atmosphere, or the coupling between these variables. And so if I were to add noise through the state PERT experiment to the soil temperature, then I'm basically just going to reduce the correlation. But again, as for the same reasons in the previous slide, the parameter perturbation has again enhanced the pre-existing correlations. So I think this is sort of an interesting point here, is that if you've got a coupled DA system and you perturb one of the components of that ensemble, you are going to enhance the correlations in your ensemble where that component is driving the coupling, but you're going to reduce it where the other component is driving the coupling. Whereas if we can find a way to directly perturb the fluxes between them, you're going to enhance the pre-existing correlations. Okay, so moving on to the summary and conclusions. NCEP's GFS NWP system and also all others are under-dispersed at and near the land surface. Looking at the spread in the atmospheric fields, it looks like the surface radiation is underdetermined. However, increasing this alone isn't going to be enough. And so we need to explicitly account for land model uncertainty when generating our ensembles. The land and the atmosphere have very different dynamics and different error growth behavior. So we need to think about this carefully, how we do this. And in particular, in a land system, the ensemble spread is going to be determined very strongly by the perturbations that you apply to that ensemble, and then the local model response to those perturbations. And we saw this really clearly in my state PERT experiment, where it exaggerated the where we had a lot of spread in dry conditions. And that local response is also going to be determined by the local conditions, and so it's going to have a really strong climatological impact. Climatological signal, which makes me think, like, what is the role of errors of the day within this? Do we even need to be running an ensemble? And I think we do. And the reason that we do is that the atmosphere is the largest driver of errors in the land model. And so the reason that we need our ensemble is to get the errors of the day in the atmospheric forcing. And this is particularly important if you think about, say, something like precipitation, because precipitation can change the soil moisture quite dramatically. And then when that soil moisture changes, that can actually even change the direction of your error covariances between the land and the atmosphere. And so I think we still do need to use the ensemble system. So my last slide, some recommendations. While this study wasn't focused on offline systems, my comparison to offline system does point out a few things. First is I think we should be replacing that current method of regularly perturbing the model states, as it creates an unrealistic spatial pattern. And I would recommend replacing it with perturbing the parameters. And also obviously using atmospheric forcing in place of perturbing a single atmospheric realization is more likely to give us realistic spatial patterns in our ensemble spread. For coupled data assimilation, I would recommend using ensemble perturbation approaches that directly target the fluxes between the components to create error covariances that are representative of errors between those fluxes, as I just talked about. And then finally, in NCEP system, we're applying that parameter perturbation approach, although I've expanded it to perturb some more parameters. And then I'm developing an ENKF to assimilate the 2-meter observations. And then, as I mentioned before, I've got some colleagues at EMC who are looking into the impact of these land perturbations on the model skill. And if you want any more information on this, there is a paper in press in Journal of Hydrometeorology. Thank you.
Thank you, Clara. And let's see. Okay, so while Peter Jan is writing one question, I have maybe just would like your comment on this. So if you are perturbing these parameters, what would stop you, for example, to try to actually use data assimilation and to estimate those in addition? And would this help any further in the spread?
That is the next thing I want to do. It's a really obvious thing to do is, we're spending all this effort at the moment assimilating the states. Part of the reason we are updating the states is, you need to have spread in the parameters in your ensemble to be able to update them. So yeah, that is totally the next step of this work. And I'm hopeful that it would be quite, could be quite beneficial.
Okay, thank you, Clara. Now, Petayan, is it known where the largest errors are in the land surface models? Sorry for ignorance, he says as well.
Well, the largest errors in land surface models by far are actually biases, which I haven't talked about here at all. I think beyond that, if we're talking just about the random errors that we're interested in from a bias blind data assimilation perspective, my intuition would say the atmospheric forcing. Because the models themselves certainly do have a lot of errors, but they tend to be more systematic. That's a bit of a simplification, but and precipitation would probably be the main thing I would focus on, particularly. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Clara. Okay, so I think in case there are no more questions, I would like to thank all the speakers, and actually